A bearded man shoved a trembling little girl into the mud, his boot grinding her face into the cold, wet ground. "Street trash," he hissed, "worth more sold than saved." She clutched a torn stuffed rabbit to her chest, the only piece of love she had left in a world that didn't want her. And no one stopped. Not a single umbrella paused in the rain. But just a few steps away, a war-scarred veteran stood silent beneath the storm, a loyal German shepherd at his side. He hadn't planned to get involved. He never did. Yet, something about the sight, the small girl, the broken toy, the cruelty, pierced through the armor he had built around his heart. He didn't know it yet, but that night was the night both of their lives would change forever. As you listen, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Make sure to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart. Now, let's begin. Rain fell in relentless sheets over Seattle, washing the streets in silver and shadow beneath the dim glow of flickering streetlights. The alley behind the crumbling brick tenements reeked of rot and cheap liquor. It was here that Sophia Miller, a 7-year-old girl with thin limbs and skin as pale as moonlight, stumbled and fell face first into the mud. Her blonde hair, tangled and matted from weeks of neglect, clung to her tear-streaked cheeks. Her red cotton dress, once bright and childish, now hung in tatters around her knees, soaked and heavy with rain. She clutched a worn-out stuffed rabbit to her chest, its one remaining button eye staring blankly, the last remnant of a life she could barely remember. Behind her, a drunken man with a ragged beard shouted curses, his boots splashing through puddles as he hurled a bottle at her retreating figure. "Street rat!" he spat. "You're worth more sold than saved." Sophia didn't look back. She had learned long ago that looking back only slowed you down. Her small feet slapped against the wet pavement, barefoot and raw from running. The cold gnawed at her bones, and every breath burned as if her lungs were on fire. Hunger twisted inside her belly, but fear was stronger. Fear was always stronger. The men who had chased her earlier had finally stopped, their laughter fading into the storm. But the memory of their hands, grabbing, pulling, clung to her skin like the rain. She had nowhere left to go, no family, no home, only the streets, only the storm. On the hill above the city, where the rain softened into mist and the skyline spread like a painting below, stood the Grayson estate, a sprawling stone mansion with ivy crawling along its weathered walls and warm golden light glowing faintly from within. It was here that Nathaniel Nate Grayson lived, a man whose life had once been defined by duty and sacrifice. Nate was 50 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair cropped short and a thick beard streaked with silver. His eyes, a deep stormy blue, carried the weight of wars fought and friends buried. His face was rugged, lined with the quiet map of grief. Once a decorated Marine, he had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, where courage and loss had carved away the softer parts of him. The war had ended, but the battles had not. PTSD haunted his nights, replaying ambushes and screams in endless loops. And when his wife Eleanor succumbed to cancer, and their only son Michael died of a rare blood disease at 7, Nate's world collapsed entirely. He withdrew into solitude, isolating himself inside the mansion he had inherited from Eleanor's family. Wealth meant nothing now. His days were quiet, mechanical, morning walks, black coffee, newspapers he never finished, and his only companion was Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat, intelligent amber eyes, and a steady, loyal presence. Shadow had once served alongside Nate as a military K-9, trained for search and rescue, and though the dog's body bore a faint scar on its left flank, his spirit remained unbroken. Shadow was more than a dog. He was the last thread tying Nate to the world beyond his walls. It was Shadow who sensed her first. Standing by the rain-streaked window of his study, Nate watched the storm lash the darkened garden, his mind wandering back to memories he had tried to bury. That's when Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, and let out a low, questioning whine. Nate followed the dog's gaze toward the hedges near the wrought iron gate. There, barely visible through the sheets of rain, was a small, trembling figure. At first, Nate thought it was an animal, maybe a stray, but as the figure stumbled closer, he saw the thin arms wrapped around a sodden toy rabbit and the small face half hidden beneath a curtain of wet hair. Sophia had found her way into the estate through a narrow gap in the fence, scraping her elbows as she squeezed through. She crouched beside a wooden doghouse tucked beneath the veranda, Shadow's shelter for sunny days, and pressed herself into its shadow, hugging her knees to her chest. The smell of wet cedar and old straw was strangely comforting. For the first time in days, she wasn't moving. She wasn't running. She could almost pretend she was safe. Nate's breath caught. The sight of a child, this child, alone in the rain, struck him harder than he expected. It was as if time folded back, and he saw his son again, pale and fragile in a hospital bed, whispering that he was cold. The ache that never left his chest tightened until it was almost unbearable. He should call someone, the police, child services, anyone but himself. But his feet moved before his thoughts could stop them. When he stepped outside, the rain soaked through his flannel shirt and jeans instantly. Shadow padded beside him, tail swaying low, cautious but curious. As they approached, Sophia tensed and pressed herself deeper into the doghouse, her wide brown eyes darting between the stranger and the large dog. "It's all right," Nate said softly, his voice deeper and calmer than he felt. "We're not going to hurt you." Sophia didn't answer. Her lips trembled, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so small it almost vanished beneath the rain. "Can I sleep here? In the dog's house? I'll be quiet, I promise." For a moment, Nate couldn't speak. Of all the things she could have asked for, food, money, help, she wanted only a corner of space in the cold, beside a dog she didn't know. He knelt slowly so his eyes were level with hers. Up close, he could see the mud on her cheeks, the bruises fading along her arms, the shiver that racked her thin frame. She was terrified, but beneath the fear was something else. Hope. Faint, stubborn, desperate hope. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sophia," she whispered, as if the word itself was fragile. "Well, Sophia," he said, glancing toward the doghouse, "I think Shadow here wouldn't mind sharing, but I can offer you something warmer inside." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Inside?" she echoed, like it was a word from a language she had forgotten. "Yes," Nate replied, rising to his feet. "Inside." She hesitated, glancing at her filthy feet and dripping dress. "I'll make a mess." "Furniture can be cleaned," he murmured, and for the first time in years, he felt the truth of those words. With cautious, almost fearful steps, Sophia followed him toward the mansion's heavy oak doors. Shadow trotted beside her, sniffing her small hand before brushing against her leg, a silent welcome. Inside, golden light spilled across the marble floor, warm and soft compared to the storm outside. Sophia's breath caught as she gazed at the towering staircase, the chandeliers that glimmered like stars, the walls lined with oil paintings. It was a world she had never imagined, let alone touched. "Come on," Nate said, motioning gently. "Let's get you warm." And as she stepped over the threshold, leaving the storm behind, neither of them knew that this moment, this night, would change their lives forever. The rain had not stopped by the time they stepped into the house. It thudded against the tall windows of the Grayson estate like impatient fingers, drumming a rhythm that neither Nathaniel Grayson nor the little girl beside him could ignore. The warmth inside was a gentle contrast to the biting chill that clung to Sophia's fragile frame. Her soaked red dress clung to her bony shoulders, and her lips, tinged a faint bluish hue, trembled with exhaustion and fear. She held her stuffed rabbit tighter, as though letting go of it might cause the ground beneath her to vanish. Nate closed the heavy oak door behind them, sealing out the storm, and for a long moment, silence hovered between them. He stood awkwardly by the entrance, rain still dripping from the hem of his flannel shirt, and studied the child he had just invited into a life far removed from hers. He was a man accustomed to solitude, the measured silence of an empty house, the soft padding of his dog's footsteps, the low hum of the radio that played only for company. But this silence felt different. It was uncertain, hesitant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "Let's get you warm," he said at last, his voice low and careful. Sophia followed him with timid, uncertain steps, her bare feet leaving wet, uneven prints on the polished wooden floor. Shadow walked beside her, tail swaying gently, occasionally brushing his muzzle against her tiny hand, as if to reassure her. The German Shepherd had an uncanny instinct. Years of training as a K9 and a lifetime of loyalty had sharpened his sense for fear, for danger, for grief. And he sensed all three in this child. Nate guided her to a guest bathroom, one she had never imagined existed. The space was larger than the room she had once shared with 5 other children. White marble tiles stretched up the walls, and the light from a crystal chandelier reflected on the silver fixtures. When Nate turned the taps, warm water poured into the tub, steam curling up like breath in the cold. Sophia stared at it in disbelief. Warm water was not something she associated with safety. In her world, water came from leaking pipes and dirty buckets. "You can take a bath," Nate said, retrieving a stack of towels, soft, thick, and clean, from the cabinet. "It'll help you feel better." She hesitated, glancing down at her dirt-streaked arms, the bruises that peeked from beneath the tattered fabric of her dress. "For me?" she whispered, as if the idea itself was impossible. "For you," he replied simply. When she finally slipped into the bath, the warmth wrapped around her like an embrace she hadn't felt in years. She closed her eyes and exhaled for what felt like the first time that night. While she soaked, Nate waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. His mind was a storm of contradictions, questions he didn't have answers to, and emotions he thought he had buried with his past. He hadn't been around children in years, not since Michael. And yet, here was this girl, barely more than a ghost in the rain. And already she had breached the walls he'd spent a lifetime building. When Sophia emerged wrapped in a towel far too big for her, she looked transformed. Her hair, though still tangled, now fell in soft, damp strands around her face. Her cheeks were flushed with warmth, and her small hands gripped the towel like a shield. Nate offered her one of his old shirts, plain white cotton that fell past her knees, and she slipped into it with careful precision, as if afraid she might tear it. "You must be hungry," he said, leading her into the kitchen. The kitchen was a space Nate rarely used beyond brewing coffee and heating leftovers. Tonight, however, he moved with purpose, opening cabinets and rummaging through drawers. The refrigerator was lined with gourmet ingredients. Expensive cheeses, imported sauces, bottles of wine, but none of it seemed right. In the end, he warmed a pot of milk, whisked in cocoa powder, and set a plate of cookies on the table. Sophia climbed awkwardly onto one of the high chairs, her small legs swinging far from the floor. When Nate placed the mug before her, she wrapped her hands around it as if it were treasure. The first sip made her eyes flutter shut, and a soft sound, half sigh, half sob, escaped her lips. "It's too good," she murmured. Nate looked away, his throat tightening. "You can have as much as you like." She ate slowly, savoring each bite, but he noticed her slip a cookie into the pocket of the oversized shirt when she thought he wasn't looking. Old habits, he thought. Habits built from hunger, from uncertainty about whether tomorrow would bring another meal. He didn't stop her. He understood. When the food was gone and her eyelids grew heavy with exhaustion, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I sleep on the couch? I promise I won't make a mess." Nate stared at her for a moment. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for permission to exist, to take up space in a world that had repeatedly told her she didn't belong. Something in his chest shifted painfully. "You'll sleep in the guest room," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes widened, as if he had offered her a palace. "Really? Really?" He led her up the grand staircase, the old wood creaking under their steps. The guest room was large and rarely used, a relic from a time when laughter and life had filled the house. The bed was vast, draped in soft linen so white it almost glowed. Sophia stood frozen at the threshold, staring at it as though she were looking at a cloud. "It's too big," she whispered. "It's yours tonight," Nate replied. He adjusted the pillows, an awkward, unfamiliar gesture that betrayed how long it had been since he had cared for anyone but himself. She climbed onto the bed, sinking into the folds of the blanket, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm. As Nate turned off the main light, leaving only a soft lamp glowing by the bedside, he heard her voice from the darkness. "Thank you, Mr. Nate." He paused in the doorway, the simple words cutting deeper than any medal, any salute, any accolade he had ever received. "You're welcome," he whispered back. That night, Nate sat alone in his study, the rain still tapping gently against the windows. The house felt different. Not louder, not busier, but warmer. And somewhere down the hall, a little girl who had asked for nothing more than a corner of shelter was sleeping peacefully in a bed that had once belonged to his son's friends. It was a thought that stirred something he hadn't felt in years, the fragile beginnings of hope. The rain that had battered Seattle through the night had softened into a cold, silvery drizzle by morning. Thin beams of muted sunlight pushed through the heavy clouds, washing the streets in a gray hue that mirrored the heaviness in Nathaniel Grayson's chest. It had been years since he'd woken to the sound of light footsteps in the hallway, but that morning he heard them, soft, hesitant, almost apologetic, followed by the low thump of Shadow's tail against the floorboards. When he stepped out of his bedroom, he found Sophia crouched by the front door, staring at the rain-speckled glass, her stuffed rabbit tucked securely under her arm. She looked different now. Her hair brushed into soft waves, her skin a little less ashen after a night of real sleep, and the oversized shirt he'd lent her hanging loosely from her thin frame. But beneath those small changes, the same wary tension still lived in her eyes, the kind of fear that doesn't fade overnight. "Morning," Nate said gently. She turned and gave a shy nod, her lips curving into the ghost of a smile. "I thought we could get you something warmer to wear," he added, "something that actually fits." The mention of clothes made her cheeks flush pink. "Really?" she asked, as if the idea was too generous to be true. "Really," Nate replied with a nod. Shadow barked once, almost as if in agreement, and trotted toward the door, ready for the day's outing. Downtown Seattle buzzed beneath the light rain, umbrellas blooming like flowers above the heads of hurried pedestrians. Nate parked his weathered black pickup truck near Pike Street and led Sophia into a small boutique tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore. The shop was cozy and warmly lit, its walls lined with racks of wool coats, thick sweaters, and sturdy boots. Sophia's eyes widened as she stepped inside, her small hands brushing against the soft fabrics. She moved cautiously, as if afraid to touch too much, to want too much. The shopkeeper, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and short silver hair named Marianne Clark, approached them with a smile. Marianne, in her mid-50s, had a gentle, grandmotherly air about her. Her life had been spent running this small store since her husband passed, and she prided herself on spotting those who needed help without asking. "She's beautiful," Marianne said warmly, kneeling slightly to meet Sophia's gaze. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophia," the girl murmured, gripping her rabbit tighter. "Well, Sophia," Marianne said, "I think we can find you something special today." It took nearly an hour, but by the end, Sophia stood in front of the shop's mirror, wearing a navy blue coat with a faux fur hood, a red wool scarf wrapped gently around her neck, and a pair of sturdy brown boots. Her eyes sparkled faintly as she turned from side to side. "I've never had clothes like these," she whispered, almost to herself. "You deserve them," Nate said softly, his voice catching in his throat. The moment was brief. As they stepped out of the store, the drizzle had thickened again into steady rain, and with it came a chill not from the weather, but from the presence waiting on the street corner. 3 men detached themselves from the alley's shadows and approached. They walked with the kind of confidence born from cruelty, their eyes locked on Sophia. The tallest of them was Mark Riley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 40s with a heavy beard streaked with gray and a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jawline. His dark leather jacket strained against his muscled frame, and his cold blue eyes carried a ruthless intelligence. Mark had grown up on the streets, clawed his way into the underworld through violence, and built a small empire trafficking vulnerable children. To him, Sophia wasn't a person. She was property. Beside him stalked John Davis, 38, lanky and sharp-featured with greasy black hair that clung to his forehead. A failed boxer with a temper that often flared into brutality, John handled the discipline side of their operations. His knuckles were swollen and scarred, a silent testimony to years of violence. The third man was Leo Turner, a younger recruit in his late 20s, small and wiry, with a nervous twitch in his left eye. Leo was the lookout, a petty criminal who followed orders without question, too afraid of Riley to ever resist. "Well, well," Mark sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Look who's playing dress-up." Sophia froze, her body stiffening as terror flashed across her face. Her grip on Nate's coat tightened until her knuckles turned white. "She's ours," John growled. "You can hand her over, or things get ugly." Nate stepped forward, his expression turning to stone. "She's not anyone's," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. "Least of all yours." Mark chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "You think this is about her? It's about respect. She walked away owing us, and nobody walks away owing us." It wasn't the threat that struck Nate hardest. It was the way Sophia's shoulders curled inward, the way her eyes darted to the ground, as if she was shrinking back into the cage they had built for her. That told him everything he needed to know. "How much?" he asked quietly. Mark's grin widened. 5,000 today, and we forget we ever saw her." Nate's jaw tightened. He hated the thought of paying them. It felt like giving them permission to keep doing this, to keep hurting others. But right now, Sophia's safety mattered more than his pride or his principles. Slowly, he reached into his wallet and pulled out a thick wad of bills. "Take it," he said coldly, "and stay away." Mark snatched the money with a laugh. "Pleasure doing business," he said, before nodding to his men. They slunk back into the alley, their laughter echoing down the rain-slicked street. Sophia didn't speak on the drive home. She stared out the truck window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Shadow, sensing her unease, rested his head gently on her lap, and she stroked his fur absent-mindedly, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. That night, Nate sat alone in his living room, watching the fire crackle in the stone hearth. He had thought money would solve the problem, but he was wrong. The fear in Sophia's eyes had not disappeared. It had simply gone deeper, hiding beneath the surface where it would haunt her. The doorbell rang just after sunset. Standing on the porch was Clara Rossi, a social worker in her mid-30s with chestnut-brown hair pulled into a loose bun and kind hazel eyes that belied a steely resolve. Clara had spent over a decade working with neglected and abused children, her compassion forged in the fires of a childhood spent in foster care herself. She introduced herself politely but firmly, asking questions about Sophia's situation and how she had come to live with Nate. Not long after Clara left, another visitor arrived, Evelyn Grayson, Nate's older sister. At 55, Evelyn was tall and impeccably dressed, her sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled silver blonde hair reflecting her position as a state senator. She was fiercely intelligent, politically ambitious, and deeply concerned with appearances. To her, Nate's decision to shelter a runaway child was a scandal waiting to happen. "You need to think about what you're doing," she said, pacing the living room with her arms crossed. "This girl, whoever she is, she could ruin everything. Let social services handle it. That's their job." Nate's gaze hardened. "And send her back to the hell she came from? Better that than risking our family's name," Evelyn snapped. But when Nate glanced toward the hallway, where Sophia stood half hidden in the shadows, her stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to her chest, he knew his decision had already been made. "I won't do it," he said. "I won't send her back." The rain outside had stopped, but inside the house, a storm was just beginning. One that would test Nate's resolve, challenge the walls he had built around himself, and draw shadows from Sophia's past closer than ever before. The rain returned with a vengeance the following week, rolling in from the Pacific and swallowing Seattle beneath a heavy gray curtain. The sky was low and brooding, the streets slick with reflections of neon lights that flickered in the puddles. Nathaniel Grayson stood by the wide bay window of his study, watching water slide down the glass like time itself. Relentless, unstoppable. Behind him, Shadow paced restlessly, nails clicking softly against the oak floor, his amber eyes flicking toward the door, as if sensing that something was about to happen. Life in the Grayson household had shifted in ways Nate hadn't fully expected. Sophia had been living under his roof for nearly 2 weeks now, and though she still spoke in whispers and startled easily, there were moments, fleeting, fragile moments, when he saw a glimmer of the child she might have been. She laughed when Shadow rolled over for belly rubs. She hummed softly when she thought no one was listening, and every morning she left her stuffed rabbit propped up by the kitchen window, so it could watch the rain. It was small, almost invisible progress, but it meant more to Nate than he could put into words. Today was meant to be another step forward. Sophia was scheduled for a medical checkup. Routine, Clara Rossi had insisted. The social worker had been thorough since the day she first appeared at Nate's doorstep. At 35, Clara was the kind of woman whose presence commanded quiet respect. Shoulder-length chestnut hair, usually pulled into a neat ponytail, a calm but piercing gaze behind thin-rimmed glasses, and a composure born from years spent navigating bureaucracy and heartbreak. Beneath her gentle voice was a will of steel. "We need to make sure she's healthy," Clara had said, "and it might help her feel normal again." So Nate agreed. He drove them downtown to a modest clinic near Capitol Hill, the kind of place with fading blue paint on the walls and the smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. Clara walked beside Sophia as they entered, explaining everything in simple words, reassuring her that it was just a routine check. Nate stayed in the waiting area, flipping through an outdated magazine without reading a single word. Shadow curled obediently at his feet. It was supposed to be a simple appointment. It was supposed to be safe. But safety, Nate knew too well, was a fragile illusion. It happened in the span of seconds. Clara and Sophia stepped out of the clinic doors, laughing softly about something. Probably the lollipop Sophia had been given for her bravery. Nate rose from his chair, ready to meet them halfway. But before he could take 2 steps, a dark van screeched to a stop by the curb. The side door slid open with a violent slam. 3 figures in black hoodies jumped out, their movements fast, rehearsed. One of them shoved Clara to the ground, another grabbed Sophia, and the third pressed a folded note into Clara's trembling hand before they vanished back into the van. Tires screeched, the smell of burning rubber filled the air, and then they were gone. The world tilted. Nate's heart stopped. He ran into the street, but the van was already disappearing around the corner, swallowed by traffic and rain. Clara struggled to her feet, her knees scraped and bleeding, her face pale with shock. She thrust the note into his shaking hands. $100,000 in 24 hours, no police, or she disappears forever. The words blurred before his eyes. His chest tightened as if an invisible weight had clamped around his ribs. The world had taken his son once, cruelly, without warning, and now it was threatening to take her too. "Call the police," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to—" "No." Nate's voice was low, too calm to be anything but dangerous. "If we call them, they'll panic. They'll vanish. I know they're kind." Clara stared at him, her eyes wide. "Nate, this isn't Iraq. You're not on a mission. These people are criminals. Let the law handle it." He shook his head, jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. The law didn't protect her before. It won't now. Back at the estate, the atmosphere was heavy and still. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the living room walls. Nate sat at the kitchen table, the ransom note lying beside a half-empty glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Shadow rested his head on Nate's knee, sensing the storm brewing inside him. The veteran's thoughts were a violent mix of rage and guilt. Rage at the men who had dared to touch her. Guilt for not foreseeing it, for not stopping it. He had sworn he would never fail a child again. And now it felt as if the past was repeating itself. It was nearly midnight when Clara returned, her hair damp from the rain, her expression grim. She had filed an unofficial report, not a formal police involvement, but enough to put eyes on the streets. "You don't have to do this alone," she said quietly. But Nate was already packing. He counted the money, nearly all of his savings, liquidated in a rush from his bank earlier that day. He placed it into a worn duffel bag and zipped it shut. Then he slipped a small handgun into the inside pocket of his jacket. Old habits died hard. "Nate, please," Clara's voice broke. "Don't go alone." "I have to," he replied without looking at her. "They won't show if they see anyone else." Shadow followed him to the door, tail rigid, eyes locked on his owner. Nate knelt, resting a trembling hand on the dog's thick fur. "I need you to stay," he murmured. Shadow whimpered softly, reluctant but obedient. The docks of Seattle were a labyrinth of rusted shipping containers and flickering sodium lights that hummed faintly in the damp night air. Fog rolled in from Elliott Bay, cloaking everything in a ghostly haze. Nate parked his truck a block away and approached on foot, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, every sense heightened. The salt tang of the water stung his nose. The rain had stopped, but the night was colder than he'd expected. Or maybe it was just the fear chilling his blood. The note had been specific. Pier 47, midnight, alone. He arrived 2 minutes early. The place was deserted, save for the rhythmic creak of mooring ropes and the distant cry of gulls. Then, from the shadows between 2 stacks of cargo containers, figures emerged. 3 of them. Tall, broad, faces obscured by masks and hoods. "Where is she?" Nate demanded, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Money first," one of them said, the leader, judging by the way the others deferred to him. His voice was rough, cold, and unmistakable. Nate recognized it immediately. Mark Riley. Nate tossed the duffel bag forward. "Now bring her out." Mark unzipped the bag, thumbing through the stacks of cash before nodding to his men. One disappeared into the darkness, and moments later, a small, thin figure was shoved into the light. Sophia. Her hands were bound, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. But when she saw Nate, her eyes lit up with a fragile spark of hope. "Mr. Nate!" she cried out, her voice breaking. "Let her go," Nate growled. "Not so fast," Mark sneered. "We said no police. And yet," he gestured toward the distant streetlights, "I see watchers. If this is a setup—" "It's not," Nate snapped. "It's just me." Mark studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a cruel, joyless expression. "Good. Then you understand how this works. Next time, there won't be a ransom. Next time, she disappears." And with that, they vanished into the maze of containers, leaving Sophia stumbling into Nate's arms. He held her tightly, his breath shaking, his heart pounding so hard it felt as if it might break through his ribs. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his chest. "I'll always come," he murmured. And in that moment, the world narrowed to the feel of her heartbeat against his, fragile but alive, a promise he would never break again. The night clung to the Seattle waterfront like a living thing, heavy, suffocating, and unyielding. The air smelled of brine and rust, the tang of the ocean mixing with the metallic bite of rain-soaked steel. Nathaniel Grayson moved like a shadow himself, boots silent against the cracked concrete of the abandoned dockyard. The duffel bag he had brought the night before was gone, his hands were empty, and yet the weight pressing down on his chest was heavier than ever. Somewhere in this labyrinth of forgotten warehouses and corroded shipping containers, Sophia was still out there, alone, terrified, and waiting for him. And he had no intention of leaving without her. The old warehouse loomed ahead, a skeleton of twisted girders and shattered windows. It had once stored imported goods from across the Pacific. Now, it was a nest for predators. Nate adjusted the collar of his weathered field jacket against the cold wind and signaled softly to Shadow, who padded silently beside him. The German shepherd, 6 years old with black and tan fur and intelligent amber eyes, had been trained to read Nate's body language during his military service. Tonight, he moved with the same focus he once did on patrols in foreign war zones, silent, alert, and ready to act. Inside, the warehouse was a graveyard of machinery and decay. Rusted cranes loomed like long-dead giants, and moonlight poured through broken skylights and fractured beams. Voices echoed in the distance, harsh, mocking, careless. Nate pressed his back against the cold steel wall and edged closer. His heart pounded not from fear, but from the razor-sharp tension of a soldier walking into a fight he knew he might not win. At the far end of the cavernous space, a single hanging bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over the scene. Sophia sat bound to a metal chair, her wrists tied tightly behind her back, her knees scraped and bloodied. But what struck Nate was not the bruises on her skin. It was the defiance in her eyes. Despite everything, despite the fear that surely coiled in her small chest, she was not crying. She was listening, watching, waiting. Mark Riley was pacing in front of her, a cigarette dangling from his lips, smoke curling around his scarred face. "You should have stayed where you belonged, girl," he hissed. "We could have made a lot of money together. But now you're just a problem." Sophia tilted her chin upward, her voice steady despite the tremor in it. "You're Mark Riley. You live on Blossom Lane. You have a daughter named Amy. She's 9. She goes to St. Francis Elementary." The cigarette slipped from Mark's lips. "What did you say?" "I heard you," she continued, her gaze locked on his. "All of you. John Davis. Your mother's in the hospital in Naples. Leo Turner. You visit your brother in Monroe Prison every Thursday." The room froze. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. John's fists clenched, Leo swore under his breath. In that moment, Sophia, 7 years old, bound and bruised, had turned the tables. She had listened. She had learned. And now she was dangerous. Mark's voice cracked as he tried to regain control. "You think knowing our names changes anything?" "It changes everything," Sophia whispered, "because now the police will know too." As if summoned by her words, a distant sound cut through the night, faint at first, then growing louder. Sirens, wailing, insistent, unrelenting. Mark's eyes widened. "They're coming," Leo hissed. "How?" John shouted. "We said no cops!" "Clara," Nate murmured under his breath. He should have known the social worker wouldn't stay out of it. She must have followed his truck, or contacted the police after he left. A part of him burned with frustration. The plan was falling apart, but another part of him, a part he hadn't listened to in years, felt hope flicker in his chest. "Pack it up!" Mark barked. "We're leaving!" Panic rippled through the kidnappers. John grabbed a crate of cash and bolted toward the rear exit. Leo began cutting Sophia loose, not out of mercy, but because dead weight slowed them down. But before they could disappear, the warehouse doors burst open with a crash. Red and blue lights strobed through the windows as armed officers flooded the perimeter, their shouts echoing through the metal cavern. In the chaos, Nate made his move. He stepped out from the shadows, every ounce of military training snapping into place. "Sophia!" he shouted, her head whipped toward the sound, her face breaking into tears of relief. "Mr. Nate!" John lunged toward her, but Shadow was faster. The German Shepherd exploded into motion, a blur of muscle and fury. He slammed into John's legs, sending the man crashing to the ground. Leo raised a knife, but Nate was already there, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. The blade clattered to the floor. With a swift strike to the gut, Leo folded, gasping for breath. Mark was the last to move, backing toward the exit with wild eyes. "You think this ends here, Grayson?" he snarled. "We'll find you. We'll—" "Not tonight," Nate growled. He tackled Mark before the man could finish, slamming him against a steel support beam. The impact knocked the air from his lungs. Police swarmed the room seconds later, weapons raised, shouting commands. The kidnappers were dragged away one by one, cursing and spitting. Nate barely heard them. He was already at Sophia's side, cutting the ropes from her wrists with trembling hands. She collapsed into his arms the second she was free, her small body shaking with sobs that she had held back for too long. "I knew you'd come," she whispered against his chest, her voice raw and broken. "I told you," he murmured, holding her tighter than he ever had before. "I'll always come." The chaos of the raid faded into background noise. The crackle of radios, the shuffle of boots, the clatter of handcuffs. All Nate could feel was the weight of the child in his arms, alive and safe. And for the first time in years, something inside him shifted. He had spent so long believing his life ended the day his son died, that there was nothing left for him but quiet mornings and empty nights. But as Sophia clung to him, he realized how wrong he had been. She wasn't just a child who needed saving. She was the reason he still had something to live for. Later, as the police escorted them out of the warehouse and into the soft glow of streetlights beyond, Clara rushed forward, her face pale but her eyes full of relief. "She's safe," Nate said hoarsely, handing Sophia into her waiting arms. "She's really safe." The social worker nodded, tears streaking her cheeks. "You did it." "No," Nate said, glancing down at the little girl now clutching his hand. "We did it." And somewhere deep inside, beneath the scars and the grief and the ghosts of a life he thought was over, a flicker of warmth began to burn. It was small, fragile, but it was real, and it was enough to light the way forward. The winter clouds over Seattle had begun to loosen their grip by the time 6 weeks passed, though the air still carried the faint chill of rain and the sea. The cedar trees lining the driveway of Nathaniel Grayson's estate dripped with dew as morning light seeped gently through the mist, casting soft golden streaks over the old stone house that had once felt more like a mausoleum than a home. But everything was different now. The silence that used to echo in every corner had been replaced by the sound of footsteps, small, quick, joyful footsteps, and bursts of laughter that drifted through the halls like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sophia's presence had rewritten the rhythm of Nate's days. She had turned his predictable, solitary routine upside down. The mornings that once began with black coffee and long, wordless walks with Shadow were now filled with the smell of pancakes and the sound of a 7-year-old girl arguing with a stubborn German shepherd about who got to hold the leash. The afternoons once spent alone in his study now involved helping with finger painting projects or searching the garden for fairy rocks. And at night, instead of whiskey and silence by the fireplace, there were bedtime stories. Stories about brave explorers, talking animals, and fathers who never stopped searching. Shadow, too, had changed. The 6-year-old German shepherd, with his sleek black and tan coat and watchful amber eyes, had always been Nate's closest companion, loyal, protective, but distant in the way working dogs often are. Yet, since Sophia's arrival, even Shadow had softened. He followed her everywhere, curling up at her feet during story time, trotting after her as she chased butterflies in the garden. He had gone from soldier's comrade to family dog, and it suited him. And now, 6 weeks after the night that had changed both their lives, they stood on the steps of the federal courthouse of Seattle, a stately building of marble columns and bronze doors that gleamed beneath the overcast sky. Nate had faced firefights in distant deserts and walked away from explosions without blinking, but nothing had ever made his hands shake the way they did as he straightened his tie that morning. Clara Rossi was there too, waiting by the entrance. The 35-year-old social worker had become something of an anchor in the whirlwind of legal procedures that followed Sophia's rescue. Her calm hazel eyes and reassuring smile steadied Nate as she handed him a small folder. "This is it," she said softly. "The final hearing. After today, it's official." Sophia, dressed in a pale blue dress with a white ribbon tied neatly in her golden blonde hair, clutched his hand tightly as they climbed the courthouse steps. Her small face was solemn, more serious than any child's should be, but her grip on his hand was firm, trusting. "Are you nervous?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Terrified," Nate admitted with a crooked smile, "but in a good way." Inside, the courtroom was cavernous and solemn, with high-arched ceilings and tall windows that let in the morning light. A heavy oak bench dominated the front of the room, behind which sat Judge Eleanor Whitaker, a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked auburn hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Known for her fairness and deep empathy, Judge Whitaker had spent decades handling family cases, many involving children who had been through more than they should. The proceedings were straightforward but felt momentous. Clara testified about Sophia's progress since the rescue, her improved health, her growing confidence, her newfound sense of safety. A representative from Child Protective Services read their report, praising Nate's dedication and the stable environment he had created. Nate himself spoke only briefly, his voice rough with emotion, as he described how Sophia had changed his life. But the moment that shattered the carefully built composure of a 50-year-old war veteran came near the end, when Judge Whitaker leaned forward and asked Sophia a simple question. "Where do you want to live, Sophia?" The courtroom fell silent. The little girl looked around, at the lawyers, the social workers, the rows of empty seats, then turned to Nate. Her small hand slipped into his, and her voice, though quiet, carried across the room. "With him," she said. "With my dad." The word hit Nate like a physical blow. Dad. It was a word he hadn't heard directed at him in years, not since the day his own son had slipped away in a hospital bed, his body too weak to fight the blood disease that stole him. That day, Nate's heart had frozen over, but now, in a sterile courtroom under the indifferent gaze of fluorescent lights, it cracked open again. His vision blurred. He blinked rapidly, but the tears came anyway, hot, unstoppable, and real. He didn't try to hide them. Judge Whitaker smiled gently. "Then it's settled," she said, signing the final document with a practiced flourish. "As of today, Sophia Grayson is officially adopted." The gavel came down with a soft thud, but to Nate it sounded like a gunshot signaling the start of a new life. From that day forward, everything changed. The old mansion on Queen Anne Hill, once a monument to grief and memory, slowly transformed into a home. The empty rooms filled with color, watercolor paintings taped to the refrigerator, stuffed animals perched on windowsills, and tiny handprints pressed into the drying cement of a new garden path. Sophia's laughter echoed off the stone walls, erasing the silence that had haunted them for so long. There were mornings when Nate walked her to school, Shadow trotting beside them, and she would chatter endlessly about the stories they were reading in class. There were afternoons spent baking chocolate chip cookies, half of which ended up burnt, and evenings curled up on the couch watching old animated films. On weekends, they built pillow forts in the living room and camped in the backyard under the stars. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when nightmares still woke Sophia, nights when Nate found her crying quietly into her stuffed rabbit, the scars of her past still raw beneath the surface. But he was always there, sitting beside her, holding her hand until she fell asleep again. And slowly the shadows that had once defined her life began to fade. One evening, as rain pattered gently against the windows and a fire crackled in the hearth, Sophia climbed into Nate's lap, her head resting against his chest. "I'm glad you found me," she whispered sleepily. Nate's throat tightened. He wrapped his arms around her and pressed a kiss to her hair. "No," he murmured. "I'm glad you found me." In that moment, surrounded by warmth and laughter and the soft, steady rhythm of a child's heartbeat, Nathaniel Grayson, the soldier, the widower, the man who once believed his life was over, understood something he had long forgotten. The past might have broken him, but love had rebuilt him, and the home that had once been a tomb was now alive again, pulsing with joy and possibility. The spring rain returned to Seattle with a gentler hand than the storms of months before, washing the streets clean and leaving the scent of wet cedar and salt in the air. The old Grayson estate, once cloaked in silence and shadow, now hummed with life. Sophia's drawings covered the refrigerator door, half-finished science projects cluttered the kitchen table, and Shadow, the 6-year-old German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a patient soul, followed her from room to room as if guarding the center of his new world. It had been 3 months since the adoption was finalized, and every day since then had been another lesson, in laughter, in healing, in hope. But for Nathaniel Grayson, it still wasn't enough. He sat at his desk one morning, a mug of coffee cooling beside a stack of papers he had not yet signed. Outside, the sound of Sophia's laughter floated through the open window as she chased Shadow across the garden, their footsteps soft against the wet grass. Nate smiled at the sound, but beneath it, a thought that had been haunting him for weeks stirred again. What about the others? It was a question he could no longer ignore. He had found Sophia, or perhaps she had found him, but there were thousands of children like her across America. Children sleeping under bridges, hiding in shelters, clutching broken toys and broken hearts. He had been given a second chance at family, and with it came a responsibility that felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. That afternoon, Nate made a decision. It began with a phone call, first to Clara Rossi, the social worker who had become more of a friend than a caseworker. She arrived the next day, wearing a navy trench coat over her usual pencil skirt, her chestnut brown hair pinned neatly back, and a leather folder tucked under one arm. Her eyes lit up with interest as Nate explained his plan, a network of safe houses across the country, beginning in Seattle, designed not just to offer shelter, but to provide food, education, and emotional care for homeless children. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression a mixture of admiration and caution. "It's ambitious," she said finally, "but if anyone can do it, Nate, it's you." "I'm not doing it alone," Nate replied, his gaze softening as Sophia and Shadow tumbled into the room, laughing breathlessly. "She's the reason I'm doing it at all." The next step was building a team. Nate reached out to an old friend, Dr. Henry Calloway, a tall, lean man in his early 60s with steel gray hair and a thoughtful, lined face. Henry had once served alongside Nate as a medic during the Gulf War before retiring to run a nonprofit health organization for low-income families. Though he carried the quiet sorrow of a man who had seen too much suffering, Henry's compassion remained undimmed. "You're trying to fight a battle on home soil this time," he said with a wry smile. "Count me in." Then there was Marisol Vega, a fiery Latina in her 40s with curly black hair, warm brown skin, and a heart as fierce as her voice. Once a street kid herself, Marisol had risen to become one of Seattle's most respected community advocates. She knew firsthand the pain of abandonment and the resilience it forged. "These kids don't need charity," she told Nate when they met over coffee. "They need a chance, and if you're giving them one, I'll fight beside you." Together they worked tirelessly over the following months. Nate poured his inheritance, the fortune left to him after his late wife's passing, into the project. Clara navigated the legal labyrinth of permits and regulations. Henry helped design medical programs, while Marisol connected them with grassroots networks across the city. By early summer, the dream had a name, Sophia's Haven. The first center opened on a cloudy June morning in the heart of Pioneer Square, in a renovated red brick building that had once been a derelict warehouse. Its walls were now painted in warm colors, decorated with murals created by local artists depicting children holding hands beneath a sky filled with stars. Inside, bunk beds lined cozy dormitories, a kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread, and a library overflowed with donated books. There were classrooms for tutoring, counseling rooms for therapy, and even a small garden where the children could plant flowers and vegetables, a symbol of new beginnings. On opening day, the center was alive with movement. Volunteers bustled about carrying boxes of supplies. Reporters gathered near the entrance, microphones poised. Curious neighbors peeked in through the gates, but at the center of it all stood Nate and Sophia, hand in hand, both wearing matching navy coats. Sophia's eyes were wide as she looked around, taking in the space that had once existed only as an idea. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Nate knelt beside her so they were eye level. "It's just the beginning," he said. "There will be more, one in every city, if we can." As the ceremony began, Clara took the stage first, speaking passionately about the mission behind Sophia's Haven. Henry followed, sharing stories of children he had treated in war zones and shelters alike. Then Marisol stepped up, her voice strong and clear as she spoke of survival, resilience, and the power of community. Finally, it was Nate's turn. Standing before the crowd, he felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the weight of leadership, of responsibility. But this time, it was different. This was not a battlefield. This was home. "I used to believe my life ended when I lost my family," he began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But then a little girl knocked on my door in the rain and asked if she could sleep in my dog's house. That question changed everything. It reminded me that family isn't just something we're born into. It's something we choose, and something we fight for." A hush fell over the crowd. Sophia squeezed his hand. "And so," he continued, "this is our choice, to fight for every child who has been forgotten, to build a place where they are safe, where they are loved, where they can dream again. This is Sophia's Haven, and it's just the beginning." When the ribbon was finally cut, cheers erupted. Children from nearby shelters ran through the doors, their faces lighting up with wonder as they explored the space. Some clung to donated toys, others ran straight for the library shelves, while a few simply stood in stunned silence, unable to believe this place was real. Sophia tugged gently at Nate's sleeve as they watched from the doorway. "We're helping them," she said softly, her eyes shimmering. "Yes," Nate replied, his voice breaking as he knelt to pull her into a hug. "Because you showed me how." As the day drew to a close and the crowd began to disperse, Nate stood on the steps of Sophia's Haven, the evening sun dipping low behind the city skyline. He could feel the faint pulse of something larger than himself, something that had been born from pain but had grown into purpose. The ghosts of his past no longer haunted the halls of his home. They had transformed into guides, pushing him forward. And hand in hand with his daughter, he knew their fight was only beginning. Spring in Seattle had a way of softening even the hardest edges of the city. The relentless rains eased into a tender drizzle, the kind that kissed the earth rather than battered it. The clouds hung low and luminous, and the air carried the scent of wet magnolias and freshly turned soil. Nathaniel Grayson stood in the back garden of the estate on Queen Anne Hill, a place that had once felt like a fortress of grief, and watched his daughter plant the final row of flowers beneath a pale gray sky. Each bloom, from the soft lavender hyacinths to the bright marigolds, was a testament to how far they had come. The garden had always been quiet. It was where he had walked alone after his wife's death, where he had scattered his son's ashes beneath the oak tree when the boy's small heart could fight no longer. For years, the space had been a sanctuary for his sorrow, but now it was something else entirely, a living monument to healing. At its center stood a small wooden doghouse, newly built with smooth cedar panels and a shingled roof. It was painted a soft white with a deep green trim, its simplicity at odds with the grandeur of the mansion behind it. It wasn't a doghouse anyone would ever use. Shadow, the 6-year-old German shepherd with his black and tan coat and patient amber eyes, preferred sleeping by Nate's bedside. But the doghouse wasn't for Shadow. It was for something far bigger. Sophia knelt beside the structure, her blonde hair tumbling over her shoulders, her tiny fingers pressing the last seedling into the damp soil. 7 months had passed since the night she had first appeared on Nate's doorstep, soaked, trembling, clutching a torn rabbit plush, and whispering a question that shattered his solitude. "Can I sleep in your dog's house?" Now, she stood before the symbol of that moment transformed. Around the doghouse bloomed a ring of flowers she had planted herself, roses for courage, daisies for hope, and forget-me-nots for memory. And above the arched entrance, a small bronze plaque gleamed softly in the light. The words, chosen by Sophia herself, read, "For every child still searching for a home, and for those who have found one." Nate's throat tightened as he read the inscription for what must have been the 100th time. "You did all this?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Sophia turned toward him with a small, proud smile. "I wanted to make it beautiful," she said, "so that when kids come here, they know they're not alone." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than anything else could. Nate walked over and knelt beside her, the knees of his worn jeans darkening with damp earth. "You know," he said quietly, "the first night you were here, I thought I was helping you. I thought I was the one saving someone." Sophia tilted her head curiously, the way children do when they sense a deeper truth hiding beneath the surface. "And now?" "Now I know," he murmured, pulling her into his arms, "that you saved me too." They stayed there for a long while, father and daughter, soldier and survivor, wrapped in the soft hush of the drizzle and the scent of flowers. Shadow padded over and lay down beside them, resting his massive head in Sophia's lap, his tail sweeping the wet grass. As dusk fell, the house behind them glowed with warm golden light, and Nate's thoughts drifted back over the months that had changed everything. He thought of the broken man he had been, a veteran who had survived battlefields but not the loss of his family. He thought of the little girl who had asked for a doghouse, and, in doing so, had given him something infinitely greater. And he thought of the future, a future filled with laughter, bedtime stories, school plays, and family dinners. It wasn't just his life that had been rebuilt. The very definition of home had changed. Inside the house, the remnants of dinner still lingered. Sophia's first attempt at homemade lasagna, slightly burnt at the edges, but perfect in every other way. On the walls, crayon drawings told their story in bold strokes of red and blue. A soldier with gray hair and a little girl with yellow pigtails, standing under a sky full of stars. And scattered throughout the living room were signs of a life that had once seemed impossible. A soccer ball by the fireplace, half-finished puzzles on the coffee table, a school backpack leaning against the sofa. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home, messy, loud, imperfect, and alive. Later that evening, Clara Rossi stopped by for a visit. The 35-year-old social worker, now a close friend, arrived carrying a stack of papers and a small potted fern. "For the garden," she said with a warm smile, "and for what you're building, Nate." Her hazel eyes softened as she looked around. "I can't believe this is the same place I walked into last year. It's like stepping into another world." "Not another world," Nate said, glancing at Sophia, who was curled up on the couch reading aloud to Shadow. "Just a better one." A few minutes later, Marisol Vega joined them, her dark curls damp from the drizzle and her brown skin glowing under the kitchen light. The community advocate had become deeply involved with Sophia's haven, coordinating outreach efforts across the city. "We just opened our 3rd center," she announced proudly, "and the waiting list is already longer than we expected. People are starting to believe." "That's the point," Nate replied, handing her a cup of coffee. "One kid, one story at a time." As the evening deepened, the small group sat together, talking and laughing as rain pattered gently against the windows. The conversation drifted from future expansion plans for Sophia's haven to Sophia's upcoming school recital, where she had been cast as a tree, the important tree, she had insisted. When the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Nate returned to the garden one last time before bed. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth damp and fragrant beneath his boots. He stood before the little doghouse, the same thing that had once symbolized desperation, and felt something inside him settle into place. Sophia padded out behind him in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Daddy," she murmured, tugging at his sleeve. "Do you think the kids who come here will feel like they belong?" Nate turned and lifted her into his arms, holding her close. "I think," he whispered. They'll feel what I felt when you came here, that the storm didn't ruin their life. It brought them home. She nestled her head against his shoulder, her breath warm against his neck. I used to just want a place to sleep, she said sleepily, but now I have a family. And you gave me one, Nate said, his voice breaking with quiet gratitude. As they stood there beneath the fading glow of the garden lights, the city spread out below them, and the distant hum of traffic blended with the soft rustle of leaves. The world beyond still held its darkness, its storms, its cruelty, its forgotten children. But here, in this small corner of it, something unshakable had taken root. Love, home, hope. What had begun as a desperate plea from a shivering little girl had become a legacy, one that would outlive them both. And in the gentle embrace of that truth, Nathaniel Grayson finally understood. The storm had never been a curse. It had been a gift. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. They don't split the skies or shake the earth. Sometimes, they come as softly as a child's trembling voice in the rain, whispering, "Can I stay?" Sophia's story reminds us that God's work is often done through ordinary people, through open doors, patient hearts, and the courage to love when it's difficult. It shows us that even the darkest storm can carry a blessing inside it, that a broken past can lead to a beautiful future, and that what seems like the smallest act of kindness can change a life, and even save one. And just as Nathaniel's life was transformed by answering one simple plea, so too can ours. Every day, we pass by countless Sophias, in the streets, in our neighborhoods, even within our own families, people silently praying for warmth, for hope, for someone to see them. Maybe you are the answer to that prayer. If this story touched your heart, let it move you to action. Comment below and tell us about a moment when kindness changed your life. Share this story to remind others that miracles still happen, sometimes through people just like you. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more stories that celebrate faith, compassion, and the incredible power of love. May God bless you and guide you to be a beacon of light in someone else's storm. And may every "Can I stay" you hear be a chance for grace, a chance to build a home, a family, or even a miracle.